What up, punks? Welcome back to another episode of the Pop Culture Punks podcast. I'm your host, Phil, and across from me is your boy,
Josh.
This week, we will be talking about some things surrounding Game of Thrones and other media, and kind of diving into how we analyze things and giving a little bit of tips and tricks on how to view shows and movies and whatnot, and kind of talking about how different people do that sort of thing.
It's kind of like the Pop Culture Punks flavor of media analysis.
Yeah.
So it's not the be-all, end-all, but it's just how we do it.
How we do it. And you might be wondering, where's the RIP episode that you were promised? Some scheduling conflicts happened, and that's kind of been pushed to a later month.
Potentially,
We'll keep you filled in with social media and other episodes and stuff. So but this week we'll be talking about analysis and kind of how we look at things and how we approach doing the podcast, kind of.
Definitely.
So before that, we got some notes for the show. Just a reminder, we're not doing Pop Culture Recs anymore on each episode. We'll be doing more of a monthly video for our YouTube channel called Pop Culture Recs, I guess.
Yep.
And we'll be releasing that on May 31st.
So the first ever one.
For the first ever, so that'll be the May Pop Culture recommendations. And our goal right now is to do one a month and just kind of feel it out that way. Feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel and then leave a like and comment on whatever you watch and keep out for that as well. Whatever. I don't know what I'm saying. Nah. We will be also doing a Pop Culture Punks Plays, sort of like a gameplay series that we'll be doing as well, where we try out new games, old games, whatever we're kind of feeling that month. And we'll be doing that once a month as well right now. And that will also come out the last week of May, the Tuesday and Thursday. So we kind of have a little bit of a full week of content the last week.
So that's the 28th and the 30th.
28th and 30th. And we'll be taking a look at Rage 2. So tune in for that.
Yeah.
Another note, there will be no episode next week, actually. Right? That's next Monday.
The 27th.
The 27th of May. We're taking a day off for Memorial Day to kind of set ourselves up well for the summer and make sure we got everything good to go. So, but then the week after that, stay tuned for the Imperious episode, which year 2 of the Imperious Pop Culture Punks meetup. So that'll be fun.
Yeah.
Oh, and a note that we hadn't considered, because we're doing the Imperious thing, we're going to be on their Saturday. We're going to be on their show Saturday. So Saturday at 7 p.m.
So May 25th at 7
p.m. May 25th at 7 p.m. Central Time on Imperious Recs, their YouTube channel. We'll be live streaming book club discussion about the second volume of the Saga of the Swamp Thing comic by Alan Moore. So if you're interested in the comic, check it out. If you're interested in us, check it out. If you want to see who these Imperious Recs people are and why we keep talking about them, check it out. If you're a friend of the show, check it out. Like, it'll be a fun time. We'll probably have a couple drinks in us, and it'll just be a goofy, foolish time. So that'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I was kind of skeptical just because I'm still, I feel like, an amateur comic reader, and that I'm kind of snobby about like art and visuals and stuff like that. So I was like, I don't know if I'll be able to get into kind of the older art style.
Yeah,
dude, Alan Moore is freaking awesome. Like, I've been hooked on his stuff so far.
Even if the art is kind of a little bit dated, which, if we say that on their show, I think they've said it before actually, and they kind of got a lot of flack for it.
Oh, dude, I can't wait.
But yeah, Alan Moore's writing just elevates above most of the things that were coming out at that time. It's just crazy.
Yeah. So I'm almost done with Volume 1, and I'm excited to dig into Volume 2 this week.
Yeah, I'm halfway through Volume 2, and I'm liking it a lot more than I like Volume 1 so far.
Nice.
So it's kind of cool.
King.
Yeah, there's some creepy stuff in
there.
dude,
him like licking people and like, ugh.
Yeah. So gross. I think that's all the announcements, and there's not a whole lot of news items. The only one kind of is the tie-in to this. So there was the Game of Thrones episode that came out last week. This whole season's been kind of contentious, and some fans don't like it because it's doing a lot of, I don't want to spoil too much for other people, but some fans aren't liking what they're doing with characters, and it's kind of rushed because it's only 6 episodes rather than the usual 10, and there's just a lot of weird decisions that are kind of unclear why they're making them. And so, but then it's kind of become this back and forth between like people saying, well, I don't like this, so they should change it, and then people saying, well, just because you don't like it doesn't mean it's wrong, and then pointing out all these things throughout the series that kind of point to it.
Actually,
and so like,
correct,
but then there's kind of a middle ground, which is where I kind of fall, where like I disagree with what they're doing, but not because I think it's wrong, but because they didn't give it enough time to actually set it up in the last season. And so I think there's just a lot of different things going around that led to some people like actually starting a petition, which has like 500,000 signatures at this point, for HBO to literally like rewrite, reshoot, and everything the last season of Game of Thrones. And so it's like, it's kind of become this whole cultural weird debate about it, about like fan entitlement, and like you're allowed to not like something, but like you're like, creativity is not a democracy, it's a dictatorship, kind of, is the quote I've heard tossed around.
Yeah.
And so like it's kind of this idea of how much do we as fans and of creatives kind of have control over what people are creating. And then so it's been a weird debate. So we kind of figured we would kind of go into, well, how do we analyze things and look at things, and how do we kind of step back and kind of try and remove that personal connection we have to things, to really look at things and stuff like that. So
definitely. Yeah.
That's kind of the context for this.
Yeah. And to add into, so Phil and I come from a background like academically, I come from a literary analysis background. Like I studied English and creative writing. That was one of my majors. And in comm arts, like we did a lot of film analysis and looking at, like, you just were forced to dig really deep into the details. And I think over, you from like religious studies and looking into, I remember like, we've mentioned a couple times, like we took a religion and anime class together. And I know your background as well, like you have to dig into very heady philosophical and theological ideas. And so like naturally we've been pushed through our academic career to dig below the surface and not see things as just, well, this is just bad because it didn't make me happy, or like, well, I didn't like how this character did this, but actually trying to understand, well, like, why did this character do this? Is there justification? Is this meant to make me feel a certain thing? And am I feeling the correct thing? Or like, what does that say about me as the audience versus like the creator? And are there times when the creator actually is in the wrong and they actually did something that incorrectly, is communicating something that they're trying to do, but they didn't communicate that effectively versus what it seems they were building up to. And so I did, I'm just, as I'm looking at it, is really interesting. Because I was listening to Mega 64's most recent podcast, and two of the guys have been invested in the show, or three of them. So Rocco like binged it in like a couple weeks. He's like
Game of Thrones.
Yeah, and so he's caught up. And then Sean and Derek, who are two of the other guys, they all watched it. And Sean and Derek were like, this sucks. Like they were so livid with this show.
That's how I felt when I was watching it. I even tweeted, I was like, this is just bad.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, and so then Rocco, who watched it really recently, he said he actually enjoyed it, but he gave the caveat.
He also doesn't like Watchmen, so he can
right. So yeah, talking trash on Watchmen, but I thought it was interesting because I feel like their discussion was very enlightening. Because I mean, they're goofy guys, and like their whole podcast is just like riffing on stuff, and it's highly recommended. It's one of my favorite things to listen to ever.
My first episode was the Christmas
one. It's so good. But I think what was very telling is you had Rocco, who's coming from the perspective, and this is all from and to also say, like, I have not watched any Game of Thrones, so I'm not necessarily coming at this controversy, but hearing what they've described, and from what I've kind of spoiled for myself digging into the controversy, it's interesting that a lot of people who are really upset, some of them seem to be too detached from like other details. And there's, I read a couple articles where people had 50 point lists of like, season 1 episode this happened and this character did this, and like season 6 episode this character said this, and then there's this. And so like there's evidence on the show that these characters are doing things, but it sounded like from Sean and Derek's perspective that there was like, and this was what was interesting, I'm curious what you think of this idea, is it was almost as if they, over the entire show, when they were pulling from the books, they were still following by what the book had established as that world's rules. And it seemed like everyone is really upset because in season 8, it seems like some of those rules are getting tossed out the window. And so like
I think it's
like some of the logic, some of the characters actually thinking through good decisions, like they mentioned, spoilers potentially, because I don't know or really care.
Pretty much everything will be spoilers, because
so this is all going to be giant spoilers for like any game, any movie, any show or book that we throw out as an example will be spoilers. So I'll try and list them in the description so you know. So Game of Thrones spoilers. They were describing like a scene where one of the characters like is a dragon, and like somehow like this giant fleet of people like I think it's like the Lannister army like doesn't put up a barricade behind them, and so this dragon comes back out of nowhere, and they're like, wait a second, you're telling me that these warlords who have been fighting and waging these wars like didn't think to point one gun backwards? And like it just felt like that they said that it seemed that the show writers right now are crafting moments, they're not crafting a story.
Yeah, and I think, at least from my perspective, I think that all has to do with timing.
Sure.
I think because it's 6 episodes, there's just not, like, it feels like George R. R. Martin told them, like, here's what I plan to do for the end.
Mm-hmm.
Here's some plot points. And they're like, okay, let's make each of those plot points an episode. Instead of like, let's craft a story around these plot points and create narratives within the season that kind of builds it up, so then each of those plot points is a deserved moment that we kind of get to experience.
Yeah.
Whereas it just feels like they're kind of like beelining towards some end that they have in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it didn't feel like that all the way up until like maybe season 6, and then 7 and 8 is kind of where they started almost like losing the plot in a sense.
Sure.
And I think most of the things that happen, I'm fine with the way that they happen, because I think they fit within, like you said, that like you can go back and say like, okay, well, this character did this, 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 and this throughout all these seasons. Why don't they deserve to do this? And in my mind, like they do, but within this season, they don't, because they didn't draw the line between the last thing that they had done and then this thing.
Like this, sure.
Yeah,
that makes
so
that
it's
makes
kind
sense.
of like, I think it's just a pacing problem.
Sure.
Like the moments that do happen are dope, but they don't deserve them because of the pacing, I think.
Got it.
At least that's just the way I feel, and I think that's what a lot of people are kind of processing.
Yeah, it seems like the people who are kind of in the, like you said, like who are in the middle, because I personally think it's ridiculous. I'm tired of this, creative democracy mentality that keeps going around of like, that happened with Mass Effect 3 in the endings. There was that whole petition, and granted, BioWare changed it. I don't think they should have, but it's things like that where I think it's frustrating, and I think that's what kind of inspired us to do this discussion is the reason we can sit, because there is a level of like art is subjective completely. However, there is a certain level of narrative structure and pacing, and there's craft involved that is objective, and there's objective quality in the craft. The actual artisanship behind it and how someone uses those pieces of the craft to get different effects or to tell a unique story or to kind of mess with the viewer, to do things, that is completely subjective. That's kind of how I look at it first. So I think of like, when we did our whole discussion on Death Note, like the TV show versus the movie, and how the show is very objectively quality. There's pacing, everything is thought through. There's every bit of information is hit on, like something doesn't just happen and then it's forgotten. And like that thing that happened is like a critical point for the entire show. Every single thing carries weight and nothing is forgotten in a sense. And I mean, it's been a long time, in 36 episodes. I'm sure there's some things that it's like, that wasn't as tight as it could have been. But they play into it. Moments are earned. Like when Light backstabs somebody, it's a huge moment because it doesn't just happen. Whereas when you compare that with the craft of the film is just a giant mess. People just do things. There's no rationale. They didn't build into anything. There isn't any growth. There isn't a change mentally to get them from one thing to the next. It's just that's how they are, and they just keep making decisions that seem unearned. Which
and I think
is part of
a quote that stands out to me that I saw somebody post was, foreshadowing is not character development. And I think a lot of the things that people are pointing to as character development are actually just things that kind of foreshadowed that this character would do this thing. But they didn't actually develop the character like
to
there was
to do
like
that.
There wasn't character development between those moments in a sense.
Sure.
And maybe I'm just misunderstanding things, and that's kind of where the subjective thing comes in, because we all interpret things through our own perspective of how we want these things to be. But I think there's a weird balance of foreshadowing and character development that's happening in these last couple seasons that like feels uneasy a little bit. But then again, there's people who think it's fine. So it's kind of like, to what level can you say? And I think the important part is, no matter what you think about it, you don't get to decide whether it changes. Like it is what it is. Like go out and create your own thing. Yeah. Like that's all you can really do. Right. And so I'm curious, taking a step back, going into like the analysis stuff more. Yeah. Like I'm curious when you watch something. Yeah. Do you always have kind of that analytical mind on, or are you able to kind of
that's
shut
a
it
really
off
good
and
question.
just enjoy something versus like, or do you enjoy the process of analyzing, and or does it ruin things for you sometimes?
That's a really good question. I think my personal perspective, and this is interesting, as I've kind of this whole episode might sound very like heady and just kind of jumping around, but I think that's partially because we're almost analyzing ourselves in a way and having it's really hard to think through how do I communicate how I like watch a show.
Yeah,
and then pick
this
out
episode
the
is
details.
kind of a way for us to process our own way of processing things. So it'll be hopefully a cool experiment.
Definitely. So to that point, I think I don't think there was ever a point where analyzing things made me hate things more. I think if anything, over time, especially as my own craft has been maturing, and as I've been stepping more into the field of making things and having to actually think through things and design things and be that person who's making something that other people will see and judge and think about, it's given me even more respect to even enjoy things that are really bad, to a certain extent. However, I think it's given me like those maybe C- pieces of content. I would give like Rendell like a C-, like not the greatest movie in the world. But there were scenes that were really good, and those scenes I appreciated a lot because I knew the craft of like, this is what they're trying to communicate, and they're doing it incredibly. But then on the things that pulled the grade down, it was like those are maybe like A+ moments, but then they had some some F moments too, where you're like, that just was not communicating what you're trying to communicate about this character clearly. And so I think because of that, instead of being this is the greatest movie ever or this is the worst movie ever, it kind of like averages out my opinion on things. And so then I think in other content, when I tend to be highly praising of it, because I'm pulling in so many elements that I've been taught, like what are the character motivations? Do the character motivations make sense? Are they paid off? Is the story cycle paid off? Are there things that are making me question and engage with the world deeper? Am I feeling things? Am I asking big questions? Are my big questions being answered? Like those things there's all these like little balls that I'm juggling in the midst of watching a show, and if they all are starting to like be in sync and they're making sense, and I'm not having to like they all fell and I'm having to like pick them up again, I'm like, this is stupid, like I don't even know where what I'm doing, that will drag me into really not liking something. But I think if the average or the majority of it is really good or even pretty solid, I think I tend to be more forgiving and excited and really like it. So, for example, again, like the Death Note live action was atrocious to me, but I think that's because as I was watching it, every question I had was never answered. Every thought I had about like, why is this character doing it was essentially, well, just because. Like all the deep things that I've been taught about analysis were, like being aware of what's going on. What are they communicating? Is what they're communicating making sense? And is it deserved? And when we say like, is a moment earned or deserved, I think that sounds very weird because it's like, well, yeah, because they wrote it. The idea is like, let's say I have a character who really wants to climb a mountain, and in the first 20 minutes he's already at the top of the peak. That moment isn't earned. But what earns that moment is telling a story of him like, he has a huge conflict that he's terrified of heights, and so he has to first learn, even like being at the top of stairs is difficult for him. Okay, so first he spends 5 minutes and he conquers how to like walk up the stairs and like stare down the stairs and be comfortable with that, and then he learns how to like walk up to the 3rd floor of his building and to like look over down at the street. Okay, now he's ready, and then there's like these moments building up to this, and then at the end, at the climax, when he makes it to the top of the mountain, that's a deserved, earned moment, because in that he's had to overcome things that are like, he did it, he made it, he actually had to fight to get what he wanted. Sometimes, fight means literally, like you have to fight the Titans, you have to fight Thanos, you have to fight whatever, and sometimes it's like not good, like Justice League, you have to fight Steppenwolf, who's been around for 2 minutes. Like those moments aren't earned, and those fights aren't earned because there aren't mini challenges or personal challenges or character flaw challenges that they're overcoming to get there.
Like going back to the Game of Thrones example, like there's a moment where like a main character kind of just like has a weird turn of judgment. And when you think about the sum total of everything that has been experienced throughout her life, it's kind of like in that moment, it doesn't feel earned that she all of a sudden just became this way in a sense. And it's kind of the same thing as the mountain thing where like it was just convenient that at this point they decided that, okay, now it was this way. Whereas like there was a couple of moments missing where we saw her actually becoming like going from like kind of good guy to basically like maniac genocide person. Kind of.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same sort of thing of like you said, earning something sounds almost like pretentious. Like, what do you mean? Like, it has to be earned. But it's kind of the whole point of a story is that, like, the mountain example, like, just guy needs to climb mountain, guy climbs mountain. I mean, like, okay, that's a plausible story, but, like, it's not
is it interesting?
Nobody cares.
Nobody's
there's no interesting emotional impact. There's no interesting action scenes and different things like that. And it's kind of like, it's a weird concept.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and... Two is another. So that's one thing I think is I like wrote a couple like personal rules. So I think rule number one for me is when I'm watching anything is just questions. And it's not like, well, this is dumb. Why are they doing that? It's more like, oh, that guy has like a sad face. Why is his face sad? His face is sad because his wife died. His face is sad because his wife died by the hand of his best friend that killed him, you know, like a la Punisher. You know, that whole, there's those moments where like when Frank's crying sitting next to Daredevil in the graveyard and he's telling Daredevil his whole life story, that moment of Frank tearing up is earned because we've seen we've seen him hang men, you know, gangsters on meat hooks in butcher lockers. We've seen him shoot guys in the kneecaps. We've seen him, you know, cut guys' throats open and like do all these horrible things. We've seen him though also save a dog. That doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, like we've seen him protect people and not do anything to people and show respect and honor to a lot of people, that then when we see him being saved by Daredevil, who also is earning that moment by standing up for what he believes in and sitting and hearing Frank's story, and Frank being like, I do this because my family was stolen from me by these people, these exact people, so I'm doing what it takes to get them there. That moment is earned. But if Frank Castle is just like crying all the time, you'd be like, you're just a giant emotional mess. Like, you're just like, what are you? Which you could do. That's an effect. But is that what you're trying to build Frank Castle's character to be? And so it's kind of the questions like, why is this happening? Is there a reason why this is happening? And then you kind of ground yourself in the moment, and then either that moment will pay off later and they'll be affected either positively or negatively, or usually in bad stories, there is a moment that is established and it's almost as if like that moment never happened. You know, so for, you know, I feel like I'm just going to pick on Death Note because it keeps coming into my head and I'm like ranting, but, you know, you have Light sitting in the, like the whole movie is like an hour and a half long. And so when he just goes on all these killing rampages and he's like seen as Kira, that's not earned. It's because in the show, it is multiple episodes. It is some early cat and mouse games with the police that Light dodges, and over time he slowly builds this following. Well,
and in that show, he starts off as a person where you're like, I could kind of get behind this guy.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
They started off in a way that like the reader or the viewer can kind of get behind him, and then they slowly like kind of push that line and toe the line through character development, where when they finally snap, you're like, oh wait, and now you're kind of like stuck in that dissonant state of like, do I agree with them anymore or do I not agree with them anymore? And then that moment of discomfort is earned.
Yes.
Instead of in the movie, they just start here.
Yes.
And they don't give us a reason for why this like high schooler, other than the fact that he's bullied, which
and it doesn't even
is not really
a
compelling reason for somebody being a mass murderer. Like in like a, you know,
right. But again, that's interesting, and I think that's where, for our analysis, is the questions, and my first point being that, you know, the questions involved with that. It could be really interesting, but then to me, if you're setting up that Light's whole trauma is that he is surrounded by a bunch of really awful, abusive, violent teenagers, why is he going after criminals? That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I guess I should take that back. In the real world,
you could make it like
being mass murder is kind of tied to being bullied too.
But I think it's to your point, exactly. But to your point, what they have established doesn't make sense, and there's narrative dissonance because what we're being told happens too quickly, doesn't have a lot of meaning or weight, and so then when he starts reacting and doing stuff, you're like, okay, Like, I guess this is just how it is, versus in the show, there's a slow burn, there's a buildup, there's people that eventually he has to kill to get what he really wants. And then Light Yagami, who we were originally rooting for, because it's like, all right, this is kind of an interesting idea to rid the world of evil, he slowly starts revealing what his true nature and his true character is, because he's like, oh, but he's willing to do that at any cost, even to the people he loves. And that's when things get really interesting.
Yep.
So, but anyway, so that was my rule number one. What do you feel like for you is your maybe overarching thing that you turn to when you're watching shows? And that was a really good question. And I'm curious, like, what your thought is too, of like, does being in the analytical, because I feel like you and I both naturally just watch stuff analytically. Does that ruin things for you, or does it kind of give you an appreciation?
I think since doing this podcast, there have been some movies that have been ruined for me.
Really?
I think in retrospect, because like now I've learned to look at things from a more analytical, because before I was kind of just in the mode of like, I just like entertainment. I like watching shows and movies and kind of like being entertained.
Yeah.
But now I've kind of tried to learn to take a step back and look at things, not necessarily from like the technical aspects, because I'm not really interested in how they're staging a scene or the lighting or that kind of stuff. Doesn't really
exactly.
I can kind of pick things out if it's like really off.
Right.
But usually it doesn't really get to me.
Yeah.
But I think now that we're doing the podcast, I find myself critiquing story more.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing that I find interesting is now that I've started to try and actually write my own stories, I realize how hard it is to actually like just write a simple scene or to like and make it feel like compelling or make it feel emotional or kind of like just to say what you're trying to say. So it's given me a greater appreciation for even things that like I find that aren't written well, because I know what goes into actually writing a good story, or like I know what goes into trying to actually write a compelling story.
Definitely.
And it's not easy at all, especially when you're starting. But yeah, I think having done the podcast for like 2 years now, I think there have been, I can't think of any examples right now. I think Justice League is probably one.
Sure.
Where before I would have been satisfied and just been like, that was dope.
Yeah.
And I think having seen it, I still felt the same way, but it was more like, that was dope.
But it was bad.
But it was not very good.
Sure.
And it's kind of like I can see both sides of the coin. Like,
yeah.
From like the superhero action-y perspective, there were some pretty sick scenes, but now that I know that things could be better, I see the ways that it could be written better, kind of.
Definitely.
So I think in that respect, it has quote unquote ruined things for me.
Sure.
But I think it's also trained me to kind of filter out things that I know that I'm not going to enjoy, because I think there's so little time to actually do things now that I need to kind of pick the things that I enjoy and pick the games that I want to play and pick the movies I want to watch and kind of pick things out that way.
Definitely.
So it's helped in that respect. But
for sure,
I think if I had like a rule number one sort of thing, it's usually to go with my gut first. And so I start with kind of, okay, well, how am I feeling about this? Because when it comes to like art and entertainment, I always go to feelings, because that's usually what it's trying to invoke in some ways.
Right.
And then after that, I kind of go to the questions of like, okay, is how I'm feeling, or what about this is making me feel this way?
Yeah.
And kind of examining the assumptions and different things that I'm making about what the scene is doing, or about what the character is doing, or about what the movie is doing, and then kind of piecing it back from there of like basically like some form of like cognitive behavioral interpretation of like, how am I feeling, and then kind of going back through like figuring out what the artist or writer or whatever is trying to do through the scene, and making sure that my feelings are kind of syncing up with it. Yeah. Which I think helps with critiquing things, because like if there's a character that I'm feeling like really angry at, I'm feeling angry at the character, or am I feeling angry that the character is being this way because they shouldn't be this way? Right. And I think Game of Thrones is a perfect example of that, because there's so many characters where you just viscerally hate them, and like anytime they're on screen, they make your gut churn, and like you just feel mad, and you're like, I wish this person would die already. Yeah. But like it's not because they're written bad; it's because they're written so well. It's because they're written to be hated. Written in a way that makes you like viscerally hate them as a person. Right. And so like I think my first step is always just going to the feelings. Yeah. And then kind of piecing it back from there.
Interesting. So. No, that's a good point. And I think to add on to, I think the details in becoming more analytical, and especially like you said, working and making stuff I think the general populace needs to try and write a story, and they need to let someone else read it and let it get ripped to shreds, because I think all these people calling for the petition, all these people petitioning like, well, they need to rewrite and do all this stuff for Game of Thrones. Like, I don't think you understand that if you were to try and do that, it would be horrible. And I'm not saying that as if I would do it better, but that's the point, is the humility to say, you know what, I don't necessarily like how this turned out, but it's what I got, and let's be real, I would not write anything better. Yeah. But I think there's this weird thing where fans have become so entitled to quality stuff, or what in their mind is quality stuff. They feel that, well, I can tell this creator that your stuff is crap and you need to make it better for me. Like, I've earned a better thing than what you made. But then if they were to say like, okay, well then like you write it, they'd be like, I don't know how to do that. You do that. And it's like, well then if I'm the one who knows how to do it.
It's like, if it's my job, then let me do my job.
Let me do my job.
And if you think it's bad, that's your fault.
And then and then go make something else. Yeah. Like honestly, that's one of the reasons I really started writing, is I started watching stuff that really inspired me, and I started seeing there really isn't that much stuff that is that good, or there's so many stories on the table. Like you and I came up with one in the car yesterday, like just flippantly. We're like, gosh, freaking Call of Duty and like Battlefield, and like they don't make any sense, and they have so many like their whole controversy. Like, well, what if they actually like did a story where it makes sense that there's women in the game, and what if you did it that like all their husbands got captured, and it's like all these wives who go to this internment camp and they're like rescuing their husbands and like doing all this stuff, but then maybe they got indoctrinated, so like the wife actually has to kill her husband and her son. Like that would be insane. Yeah. Like 2 minutes in the car, and it was like conflict.
And I think
interesting character development and something that builds into this thing that they're trying to do, which is like be more inclusive. Yeah. So it's like, so then if you're trying to do that, do something that makes me so emotional of like, I'm going to be choking up as I'm pulling the trigger on these characters. Why? Because you've set up a moment to be earned. It's not just, well, this is a character that you should care about just for the sake of it. It's like, no, you've earned this character having my respect. And I think it's weird because creators do that too.
That idea back a little bit further, like I have so many ideas about how I could improve Game of Thrones, or about how I could improve this thing. Yeah. And it's kind of like presumptuous of me to think that, because like I think it was Gary Vee, I don't remember, somebody said like ideas are worth nothing. Nobody cares about ideas. It's about what you actually do and what you actually create out of your ideas. And like just having ideas doesn't actually like do anything for anybody. Yeah. And it's kind of like, I think so many people have ideas about how things could be made better, but nobody is actually like making anything better, or like
definitely.
I mean, not nobody. Like, there are people who are seeing things that they don't like and getting motivated to make better things, and that's kind of what you and I are trying to do. Like, it's motivating to see a bad movie because you're like, I think I could write. It's kind of like Todd McFarlane. Like, I could draw better anatomy than this. Like, and he just sends it to like 300 people, and kind of like being persistent with like being able to make better things. And it's kind of just a learning process. And I think it's kind of an interesting divide between like being a critic sort of, and being a creator, because like there is a place for the critic, but I think it's not to be the creator. The critic is to tell other people, if you like these things, then you'll probably enjoy this thing because of X reasons.
Yeah.
The critic's role is not to tell the creator what they can and can't do wrong. Or like, chances are the creator already has a team of people that they go to for like alpha tests and beta tests and like getting revisions and all that stuff. And once it's out, the critic's job is not to tell the creator how they can improve their craft. The critic's job is just to tell like
what it
consumers is, whether it's worth your time or not to watch this.
Right.
Kind of. And I think we've got it weirdly backwards now, where like all of these armchair critics think that it's their job to like make sure the creator is like doing their job better. And most of the time the critic or the creator probably doesn't even look at reviews, because they're like, it's already out. What am I going to do?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, especially when there's certain things that it's interesting. I feel like the best critics that I really enjoy are people who have either made stuff or have a humility to say like, this is just my personal taste. Like, I just, I don't like these things, but like, hey, if you really like this, you'll probably really dig it. And then, and it's tough because there's also, I feel like, so many camps in the discussion of analysis where you have people who like, it's the same way academically, I feel like, where people pull the most ridiculous nonsense to justify, oh, well, this is like this deeper meaning and there's all this stuff hidden behind this. sometimes it's just a moment. Like sometimes it's just like, I remember it was interesting. I remember at UW reading Paradise Lost in an English class, and I love that story by John Milton. And it was interesting because, as like a Christian, I'm reading it, and the way Milton writes it is humans, what I remember feeling is like, how I'm feeling is that Milton has written this that I more associate with Satan than I do with Adam and Eve. And everyone was like, this is dumb. That makes the book bad. And I was like, but what if that's the point? Yeah. Like, I just threw that out there, and they were like, oh my gosh, like, that's interesting. Like, because, like Adam and Eve are literally like kind of cardboard cutouts. They're just kind of like there, and they're in the garden. They're like doing all this stuff, like, the general story. But there's all this time paid to Satan and all the emotion that he's the one who's feeling emotions. He's the one who's feeling betrayed. He's the one who's angry. He's the one who's like doing all this stuff. And everyone's like, Satan seems more human than Adam and Eve. And I was like but they're mad about it. Right, exactly. And they get mad about it. And it's like, but maybe that's the whole point. Like, maybe that's the whole purpose. Maybe Milton is trying to say something that, like, I as a human am closer to Satan than I am to, like, the first human beings. Like, that's an interesting concept. So what do we do with that? And that's where the discussion comes from.
And I think that's interesting because it shows that people read things and watch things and understand things differently.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important to have kind of discussions like this, where, like, if you watch Attack on Titan and you see all these things, and I watch Attack on Titan and see all these things, we're going to take different things out of it. But then when we come together and have this discussion and analyze it, we're like, oh, frick, I didn't realize that. And then you're like, oh, I didn't realize that. And you kind of like piece these things together and get a greater understanding for the material.
Definitely.
Or maybe it makes you hate it more. It's kind of like that cyclical thing. And that's kind of a cool example of you kind of seeing things from a different perspective, and then the class kind of being like, oh, that's cool. And then you get more appreciation for the book or whatever.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think, and to me, it's also fascinating too how much I feel critics trash each other too. And I think that, that's one of our goals behind this whole show, and like what we're doing is the Posy Vibes idea, that I am analyzing these things and I have my opinions and interpretations, but that's why we love discussing it, because I'm confident that I'm coming in from my singular perspective. And if I'm prideful enough to say that my singular perspective to the nth degree is correct, like, that doesn't really leave me open-minded, does it?
Yeah.
But if I'm coming with my thoughts because this is just who I am, and we're all, the billions of us that exist are all individuals and have our own different experiences and backgrounds and tastes and hatreds and all this stuff that we're pulling into how we analyze something, like, there are scenes in Attack on Titan that will wreck me emotionally, that will not make the other dude who's watching it care at all. He might hate it. He might be like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Okay, well, like, why? What don't you like about it? And that's where some of the fun is, because then you hear them start talking about it, and you're either like, those are really good points. I never thought about that, because I, from my experience and my personal life experiences, am seeing this from this context. Like, that's really emotional. And he's like, oh, interesting. I'm coming at it from this. We're like, I don't really care about that. Or he might be a complete idiot, and he's just like, well, there's just not enough hot women, and like, there's not enough this. And then you're like, well, your opinion doesn't matter, because you're not actually digging into something valuable or trying to pull like critical valuable. Yeah, it's just like super. And I think that's where it was very fun kind of digging into the Game of Thrones discussion, is because you did have people on some side who were really looking analytically at it. They're like, this just, from a craft standpoint, isn't done well. Like, it's just not good. Then you had other people who were like, man, I'm so mad that this character did this. They'd never do that. And then people were like, just kidding. They would do that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The reason that didn't work is because XXXXX. And then it's like, that's fast. So anyway, but I thought the other thing, and this is kind of like my point number 2, but this is more actually specifically about conflict. And I'm curious what your additional stuff is. But for me, I think something I really didn't grasp as an amateur, and still, like amateur, maybe moving into novice writer, would understand, is that stories literally defined our conflict. Like, a story is conflict. And if you don't have conflict in a story that is engaging or human, it's useless. Like, your story will not be received
usually internal
well.
And external conflict.
Exactly.
Like, the character has some sort of hang up about what they need to do.
Yeah.
In their mind, whether it's like fear of heights or depression or like something that's blocking them in their head, versus like an actual physical like this person will not let you pass this gate or something.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm curious what you think about this, because I feel that we've experienced that recently with games or certain movies or shows. And I think of playing God of War right now, and I think why it's so brilliant from a storytelling perspective is...
Makes me get goosebumps just
thinking
about
but
it.
But it's so well done. And the reason is, objectively, they took the story of Kratos, who's a god who's angry. They took who he is. They took Kratos, who's angry. He gets riled up. He's violent. He's just
the embodiment of masculine macho rage.
Exactly. And they put him in a situation that forces him to combat that and to actually think about what that means. Because now he has a son. He has to actually think about that. But when you think about what the game actually, like from an actual large conflict scale, the whole conflict is climbing up, like the mountain example. It's literally climbing a mountain to just I think to use my earlier idea, if the whole game was just Kratos, Atreus isn't in it. It's just Kratos, and he's like, I have my wife's ashes. I got to take him to the mountain. And you're just fighting stuff all the way up the mountain. The game would have sucked, and it would have been terrible.
It would have just been another God of War.
It would have been another God of War. But what they did is it's like, we're getting to the top of the mountain, but now Kratos has to battle himself internally and hold his anger and to train his son to not be like him. And so there's moments where there is an intense emotional internal conflict that he's wrestling with. So one of my favorite scenes in the very beginning is like they're climbing to the mountain and Atreus is looking off of the mountain. He's like, I really wish Mom could come with us with this. And the shot, and again, this is where I think the craft and like seeing the actual technical side is giving me an appreciation of like the framing is in a specific sense. It's from the back. We're seeing just a mountain off in the distance, Kratos and Atreus facing that direction, and we're behind them. And Atreus again, gosh, Atreus says this. He says, I wish Mom was with us and she could see all this. And you see Kratos kind of look to Atreus, and he's like slowly reaching out his hand, and it's kind of trembling a little bit. And he's like almost going to put his hand on his shoulder, which as a human is like he's going to comfort him.
Gesture.
Exactly. But he stops and he like pulls his hand back, and he's just like, we should get going. And that's it. We don't hear him go, you're right, I miss your mom. Like, it's just in that moment you see this little bit of humanity of Kratos that is weakness, but it's not weakness in like, oh, I don't know how to fight anymore. It's his own demon of his anger and his rage almost fighting back against him, where he's like, because I viewed the world with such animosity, I don't know how to love my son and to like comfort him because I don't want him to be weak, but I also don't want him to be me because he's angry. And then once you start thinking of that scene with all the human nuance in it and all the depth of the positioning of the framing of the scene and what the dialogue does, and what the narrative so far has built up, and that they're trying to take his wife's ashes to the top of this mountain, and the fights that are happening, and what Kratos' fear is for his son to become like who he is. It's heavy in a way, and it's like that moment. And I think that's why
stories like God of War or The Last of Us or Logan are also compelling, because they give you very tangible external and internal conflicts. Like, it's kind of almost a stereotype at this point, but like gruff male has to like basically take on this child that they're not used to being around and kind of like bring them to some destination. And it gives you those very tangible internal and external conflicts, and you get the payoff at the right point at the climax of the story, and it kind of like that whole emotional journey brings you along, and like, oh gosh, I cried so many times during playing God of War.
Oh no, I'm barely in it, so I'm like,
and it's like just so good.
Yeah,
but
so one of the things on your list that I thought was interesting, and I think this is an important part, and I'm curious what your expanded perspective is. What do you think the importance of us as the audience engaging with the content as something that's been created by somebody, and looking at authorial intent and what they are trying to communicate, even if that's like kind of like you first mentioned, if my gut reaction is X or Y, why is the author or the creator doing that to me, or like what is the effect I'm supposed to be feeling, and am I feeling the right thing?
I think it's kind of an interesting perspective, because if you're looking at something through the lens of whether it's entertainment or whether it's a creative work, I think you could argue that anything is either of those, or it's trying to be either of those. But that being said, I think there are people who are fine just watching things or reading things or doing things from an entertainment perspective, and they just go with their gut. Like, I didn't like that movie, and you're like, why? And they're like, I just didn't like it. And in my mind, like, I'm not satisfied with that.
Yeah.
But I think it's fine that people want to think that way because people care about different things.
Yeah.
So then getting rid of that opinion, I think when you jump the fence to like critique and people are saying, well, I didn't like this because it did this. And then you're like, well, I think you're wrong because of this, this, and this. And that's where we kind of get into this realm of analytical thinking. And I think I'm getting lost on what your question was now, actually.
No, sorry. I realized
I was trying to reset the scene of like, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's a good caveat, and we should come back to that. But I think I'll phrase this better. Essentially, obviously, these things that are made for us are made for an audience in mind. However, there is a person behind what has been made. And so what do you think is the importance of bringing in, like, us as the audience remembering that there was someone with, I don't want to say an agenda because that has a negative connotation, but they were trying to do something with this story. They're trying to make me feel sad or happy or empowered or inspired. Like, what do you think the importance of the audience of remembering that and maybe pulling that into our viewership of like using that as almost as like a framework to view something?
I think the first is just that they're a human being.
Yeah.
And like no human being likes to be told that their thing is a pile of trash. Like, and like even somebody who makes something that we deem a pile of trash, like they didn't make it with that intent. Like it's kind of like anytime people get like riled up and like make petitions and stuff, like you just made a petition that like 1 million people signed. How do you think these writers feel about that? Like, you're like dragging their names through the mud basically. And like, I can see why you're doing it because you're so invested in this thing, but like, why are you this invested? Like, and I think in that sense, we need to take a step back and see, while we are critiquing these things, we need to do it in a way that's not personal. And I think so much of critique, if you're not doing it properly, trends towards like the personal
like you
aspects.
Suck as a person.
We're critiquing the creator themselves rather than the creation. And I think especially like in extreme examples like the petition or Rian Johnson, for example, or like these people where like the things that they create, we do not like them, therefore the person is a terrible person who has this agenda and they're intentionally trying to make us as fans angry, kind of is the perspective. And I think that's kind of where we lose the plot in a sense. Like, sure, maybe they have a vendetta specifically against you or specifically against this certain type of fan, but I don't think that's a fair assumption in most instances. And I think that's kind of the perspective we should go into when critiquing somebody's creation in a sense. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, that's exactly kind of what I was.
And I think I try and have a more, and maybe it helps that I've been trying to create my own things and kind of thinking about, well, if I create something that sucks, which I probably will, what would the reaction I want people to have about it? Like, would I want suggestions? Would I want people to tell me that I'm a trash human being and that I should kill myself? Like, kind of like the whole spectrum of responses you see creators getting. And then when I critique something, I try and pull myself back of making assumptions about what the creator is trying to do as far as like, and then allowing my critique to kind of be a personal attack against them in a sense.
Yeah, like just literally having empathy. Like I feel like that's like,
which I think is common sense in a sense, but it seems like we've lost that. Like for some reason people like, at least lately, maybe it's social media, who knows, but like for some reason people get offended on like a personal level. Like if I watch an episode of Game of Thrones and I didn't like it, and I thought it was horrendous and terrible, and like the creator has some vendetta against fans of like lifelong fans, like for some reason people think that's like a personal attack against them. Like, oh, this Star Wars movie was bad, therefore it's a personal attack against me as a fan of Star Wars. Like, no, they just had a flop. Like it's just, like they weren't intending to make you mad, or at least I won't assume that they're intending to make me mad. I think that's kind of where it is. Like maybe they were. I don't know what their intentions were, and I probably can't know what their intentions are unless they actually tell me what they are. So it's probably a safer assumption to assume that they're trying to make the best thing that they can. I think that's what any creator is trying to do. So, definitely. I don't know. Yeah, that's kind of where I go into it with that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And that was kind of my third thing. And I want to dive into something that you just mentioned in a second. But yeah, just I completely agree. I think just kind of verbatim how I wrote it was, behind every story is a storyteller who has a vision for their world and their characters they are letting you experience. And I think when we forget that first part, is that behind every creative work is someone who made it, I think we get viscerally angry. And I think why is the sad part of our culture, which I think has existed forever. I don't think it's like a new, 21st century issue, but I think
it's just manifesting itself differently because of social media. And
whatnot. And I think my personal, this is kind of like my personal thing, is I love being a fan in analysis, and I love getting, I love Spider-Man, I love Attack on Titan, I love Punisher, I have all this merch, I do all this stuff, but those things cannot be my identity as a person, because then what happens is, and I wonder if that's sadly the state of some of this very visceral critique, and like literally to the point where it's getting personal and it's just getting mean, is this show and different creative content has become, in people's fandom, that is their identity. And so if that thing isn't quality anymore, I'm not quality because I'm a fan of this thing and this thing isn't quality.
Yeah.
Because, you can imagine like the whole person who like was such a big Game of Thrones fan. Again, this is kind of a story, but like, the person who was such a big Game of Thrones fan that, they've themed their wedding around it, and their house has like an Iron Throne in the bathroom, and they have mugs with the different house logos and stuff, and they they have a viewing party every week, and their whole life is wrapped up in this singular creative work. And now in the last season, when it's about to come to its final conclusion, it's bad. And I think that is what elevates it from people who are maybe more in the middle like you, where it's like, yeah, this sucks and I'm ticked. Or like even the people who are like, I invested 10 years into this show or however long, and like this is what I get. Totally understand, because it's like sometimes that can be the emotion of wasted time. But again, I think there's still a level of like entitlement and pride in all of those statements, where the pride of like, well, my purpose and value in life is wrapped up in my Game of Thrones fandom, and so now that the show isn't as good as it was anymore, I'm not as quality. And I'm saying that of like, I don't have evidence to prove that. That's a human condition. And I think if you don't think that's a human condition, you're an absolute idiot. And I have no shame saying that. Politicians do it. Sports fans do it. Academics do it. There is no singular group of humanity in existence that is completely absent from like wholly wrapping their identity in something that wafts and wanes in terms of its quality.
We all do it. Like I do
Exactly.
it. I've got 4 bookshelves full of books that I'm constantly waxing and waning between like, why do I have so many books, or why do I have so many CDs, or why do I have all these different types of posters, and kind of like navigating this like consumer culture where like we're almost encouraged to kind of dive all in. And I don't think there's anything wrong with
enjoying things,
like being invested in a TV show. Like I've been watching Game of Thrones. I mean, I watched it all pretty much last year, but I like I'm watching this season thinking like, what is going on here? Like something is off, and like, but it's kind of like there's a way of being really invested in something and still not having it be like your actual world or your identity. And I get it. People like quote unquote get saved by any number of things. Like people are always saying like, oh, like your book pulled me out of a bout of depression, or like your TV show like saved me from being consumed by my anxiety and stuff. And like I think that even then that like that still doesn't need to become like your whole world or your identity, and to the point where like a TV show being bad reflects poorly on your personality in a sense.
Yeah.
And I do think part of that is like people's analysis gets intertwined with kind of like if you critique the thing that they love, like it almost goes both ways. Like if they perceive the show as being bad, it's kind of offensive to them because it's a part of who they are. Or the thing is bad and they refuse to say it's bad because if like you say it's bad, then you're saying that they're a bad person for liking that TV show. And so like, and I mean, I've been in that spot. Like
absolutely.
I personally enjoyed Batman versus Superman. And so like sometimes when people like rag on it, it's like, am I a bad person for liking that movie? Like, is there some reason I'm like seeing things wrong? Or like any number of movies or TV shows, like we all have that thing where we like, it's a guilty pleasure. Like for some reason I just enjoy X, and like other people, like we don't like pop music. Yeah. But there's plenty of people who like pop music. And sometimes when we rag on pop music, people are probably Like
that hurts. Stop it.
Like am I bad for listening to Taylor Swift, or am I bad? Like, you know what I mean? And I think we all have these things that we're kind of either too much invested in, or like we have a little bit of our identity kind of tangled up in them. And
definitely,
yeah, I think that's always been a thing. I think, and I think with social media, it gives us all a voice to express why we do or don't like things, and it kind of just escalates from there. And you get like these pockets of hardcore fans that are like basically fighting till the death to change their thing. So it's like it reflects well on them, and I don't know.
Definitely, yeah. And I think to throw out that's an excellent point. And I think interestingly enough too, and this is where I look back and I feel I'm very guilty of doing this, is using my distaste for something as a moral superiority complex that I build myself on. Where, well, I'm not, you know, I think of like at different points in college, and I probably need to apologize to people, but like being like, I'm not one of these like pop music plebs who like all they care about is like superfluous lyrics about, you know, getting drunk and having sex and like doing all this stuff. Like, I'm not one of those people. I listen to emotional music like Five Finger Death Punch, like just like these bonkers things that we put ourselves into to,
and it's kind of the inverse. Like, you're just finding your identity in not liking popular things,
because I think it makes me better than other people. And it's, I don't know, it's sad. And I think, I don't know, we could go on forever, like the human condition and all this stuff, but I think like genuinely, like that's where our hearts are behind doing this whole thing, is like there is a sadness in the pop culture world when you look at it. Like, I don't want you be as mad as you want about how Game of Thrones ends, but good Lord, do not petition for these poor writers to redo it. Don't beat down HBO with, you know, all these cries for remaking the show. One, they're not going to listen because you don't know what you're talking about.
You already watched it, and they're making millions of dollars.
They're making buku dollars, so they don't care. And two, all of those people are people behind them. And I think even, you know, maybe in some of our critique videos, we've lost sight of that, and we've gotten...
Well, and I think it is important from a critical perspective depending on how you like enjoy pop culture and movies and stuff, like it is important to recognize the things you do and don't like. And if you personally think that these guys are bad writers, that's fine. I think it's okay to say like, you're a bad writer and I don't like your writing style, but that doesn't mean it's an objective fact that they're bad writers. It just means you think like somebody could not like Stephen King, and somebody thinks Stephen King has terrible endings to their books, which he's kind of known for. But that doesn't mean he as a person is a terrible person, and everybody has to think that he's a terrible writer. And like, if somebody likes his books, then they're bad because they like bad writing. It's kind of like being able to recognize subjective thought versus objective reality. Because like now the Game of Thrones writers are jumping over to Star Wars, and they're writing the next 3 Star Wars movies. So like, if somebody doesn't like them as writers, then they know, well, I probably won't like the new Star Wars movies. And that's fine. Don't go watch them. But don't watch them knowing that you're not going to like them. And then start a petition saying we need to write Star Wars, because like it's, people can't just enjoy, people can't enjoy things and pick and choose things because of, again, the identity thing. Like if there's a new Star Wars, well, I have to watch it because I love Star Wars, but I know that it's going to be bad because I know that I don't like these writers. And like, it's kind of this weird cycle of not being able to just like, the good Star Wars things still exist. Like, you can still enjoy that world. And yeah, it's like all of it gets wrapped up into the same personal view of themselves. Like, it can't just be like, you know, Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3 were awesome, and Andromeda was kind of like, nah, but you know, that's fine. I still love Mass Effect. Yeah, you're like, it's okay. Like, you can still like the good part of a thing that maybe you dipped into the bad. That's fine. Like, and I think that's the weird thing, is everyone's in this battle to be better than everybody else. And so what that boils down to is everyone just being like, well, I'm better than all these people who like superhero movies. They're a bunch of idiots, and they'll just, you know, freaking Bill Maher and like his whole thing, like all these idiots who read comics, like our whole discussion in that was essentially he's trying to create himself to be morally superior because I'm not the morons. I'm high society. I don't read comics. I think that's dumb. I also think it's dumb people who are like screaming at people who loved Captain Marvel. I think that's stupid. I think you have every right to have critiques with that movie, but like to bash someone's character because they did like it, or on the reverse because they didn't like it wholly or whatever, it's just, I think it's all wrapped up in identity. And I think we're in this climate right now where
our consumerism and the things we buy into. And I mean, that's marketing like to a T. And I think that's the game that we as the consumer have to win is this does not define me. This does not make me valuable. This does not make me have my worth. Whatever happens with this thing, like whatever. And that's okay. Yeah. I'm going to like bad shows. I'm going to like bad movies and books. And I'm going to wear stupid clothes that no one, like I'm sure if I walked around at a fashion convention with my graphic metal tees and like board shorts, I'd be laughed at. Whatever. Like it shouldn't matter. And I think at the end of the day, it's all for fun. Like pop culture should be for fun. And there's going to be bad stuff and there's going to be amazing stuff and there's going to be so-so stuff. So take it all with a grain of salt on every perspective.
I think going back to the humanity thing, like remembering, so like if you look at video games, for example, because that's one where it's kind of easy to see who's really kind of pulling the strings. Like if you look at Anthem, for example, people attacking like specific developers or specific like writers on the project, like saying you're a terrible person or whatever because you ruined my favorite franchise or something, and kind of looking at the whole scenario of like, I don't think this is a problem of bad creatives. It's a problem of creative people being mismanaged and poorly done by some corporation that's kind of doesn't really care. And I think from that perspective, it is important to know beforehand about what is going to be good or bad, because from a consumer perspective, like it's good to know that, oh, well, maybe I should be a little bit more wary about what BioWare is doing in the future because of what we've seen with Anthem and because of what we've heard about behind the scenes, what this corporation is doing to this thing. And I think in that regard, it is important to know. Or like thinking about the early DCEU movies and like, was that Zack Snyder's fault or was that WB's fault or DC's fault for trying to hamstring this whole Justice League narrative a little bit too quickly, or like kind of like thinking about the whole model of things that are being created aren't singularly being created by one person. There's, especially in movies and video games, there's a lot of people who have a lot of hands on a lot of different things.
Yep. And I think that's a really good point. And I think what our response should be to that is to have patience and grace for people that it's like, I'm not going to know what it was. And for me to make these conjectures, I think there's a lot of evidence. I think of like the Anthem thing. There's a lot of evidence that it was just mismanagement and leadership. There's been stories that have literally come out. But that's a great example of the Zack Snyder thing. He could have been forced to do things that he didn't want to do. He could have been in complete control, and WB was trying to get him to do better things that maybe we would have agreed with more. Doesn't matter because we're never going to know. And so because of that, instead of wrapping yourself up in all this controversy of what is or maybe isn't, just let it go. Like, you got what you got, and like at the end of the day, I think this is like, I've been actually personally growing and managing my like riled up more, and I think I'd be curious to see like, I've had conversations with Zach even recently where it's like, wow, you're actually a little more calm, and I think it's because I finally matured to the level, and I'm still growing, but understanding if I get really mad, like being mad isn't gonna make a new Zack Snyder movie, like being mad isn't gonna like make the other Justice League movie disappear and like a more perfected one appear in its place. What is going to do that, though, is me learning the depths of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Cyborg, and all these other characters, and me getting to the level in 15 years that I can write my own, and that's my goal.
Boom.
Done. Like, done. Like, that's what it,
or whatever
that's
your
what
thing
it takes.
Is, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm so sick, and this is my closing thought, because otherwise I'm going to start ranting, but I am just very sick of our culture being like, this is just how it is, so piss and moan about it until someone listens. I understand that there is a level where in certain spheres you do need to talk, but I think in other spheres you need to do. And I think people are not willing to do as much as they say. And that has been my personal challenge as a creative, is I think as a young, very immature creative, thinking, man, this movie sucks and this movie sucks and all this stuff. And then slowly, little by little, started dawning on me, like when I was writing a story, I'm like, oh, this is falling apart. I don't know where this is going. And then I was like, oh, I suck too. And then that was the catalyst to realize, oh, these people know a lot more. Even though I didn't like it and it wasn't good, they know a lot more than me. So instead of trying to see myself above them, learn from them, grow from them, analyze things to find the details of why I didn't like that thing and do that differently. Remember it the next time I'm writing a story, that this short story I read was trash and the reason it was trash was XYZ, and do that differently. Write it, make it, draw it, create it, read it, whatever. Like, do something. If you're gonna be upset about stuff, by all means, like, I would have been so stoked if, like, the Game of Thrones people would have been like, we wrote like word for word what should have happened in all these scenes, and we just want this out in the world, or like to be like redone. That's interesting. I still don't think they should do it, but at least all of a sudden what's coming from that is a place of like, we took the initiative to actually make something that we think is good. I still, again, don't think that that's what you should be doing in those instances. Go make your own thing.
Yeah.
But everyone wants to hijack. No one wants to make their own project and their own work. And I think that's where really the beauty in the creative process lies, is taking things from other inspirations and then using that to drive you to make amazing things that people maybe haven't seen. So anyway. Yeah.
Just to tack something onto the Game of Thrones thing, because somebody will probably be mad about it. But
yeah.
The thing that does kind of reflect poorly on the writers a little bit was that HBO offered them like as much money as they wanted to like do these last two seasons as well, and didn't restrict how many episodes it had to be. Like, that was their specific decision. And I don't know if it's true, but people are speculating that they wanted to shorten it up because they're kicking off the new Star Wars movie soon.
They just wanted
so it's kind of like they wanted to be done, which in that regard, then I do have a little bit lower of a perspective of like, so when you're bored with something, you're just going to kind of shirk it off and not give it the finish it deserves. And it does reflect poorly on future projects of like, in the third Star Wars movie, are you going to have some offer for some bigger franchise and you're going to kind of do the same thing again? And that, I think that does reflect poorly on somebody's creative ability to execute creatively.
Yeah.
So
no, that's a good.
I just wanted to add that caveat before I
think
gave
that's
my
a good
closing
point.
thoughts.
I would also add on another caveat in text. Sorry, being very serious, but I think again, that all comes down to the empathy of like, I totally agree. I think that's kind of shady, but I also don't know what it would be like to be offered to write for Star Wars. Like, after coming off a momentous world-altering project like Game of Thrones, like, so for the people who are like, you schmucks, like, dude, you've never had that happen to you. And even like what would be the equivalent of that for you as an individual? Like, if the frickin' Packers called and like asked you to coach, like be the head coach next week, like, you're telling me you wouldn't just run out on your job in this major project that you have going on, and think of all the people there that would be disappointed that you left, but you're like, F you dudes, I'm going to coach the Packers. Like, it
doesn't give you any
justify
more
it.
entitlement to having a better, like, that's their decision of how they want to wrap things up and say like, we've been doing this for 8 seasons, like, we're tired, we want to move on to the next creative project because like we don't want to be hamstringed into this thing forever. And it's kind of like, I can empathize with wanting to just get it over with. Like, if somebody offered me a better job that paid more, I'd be like, I'm out.
Done.
Like, I have no obligation to. And so it's a complex thing that still there shouldn't be assumptions made about character and people's motives.
Yeah.
And you only know what they can tell you.
Exactly.
And they haven't told you any of this stuff. So
yeah, and I think the final points on that too is then if you're mad about how they handled it from a character perspective, you be better. You get to that position and then you do it better. Probably not going to happen because it's hard.
If you were in that position, you do the same.
You do the same thing. Yep. So until you get there,
think they have the same moral high ground until they get to it. And
exactly.
Like, yeah, but it's different for me.
Exactly. And to me, that's the lunacy of it, and I think that's where. Posy vibes, folks.
Posy vibes.
Posy frickin' vibes. Like, just ride along, have a good time. Don't be afraid to critique things and not like things, but also realize that people are going to love stuff, and behind every fan is a person. Behind every creative work is a creator. Just take it all in stride. Like, it's really not.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me that I've learned, I think there was a thread on Twitter by Chuck Wendig, I think his name is. He writes like Star Wars comics and different stuff, but I see his stuff sometimes. But he talked about how like all the time people are always like quote tweeting creators in like reviews for their stuff, and it was kind of a revelation for me of like, he was basically like, don't quote tweet us in this. Like, the stuff isn't written for us. Like, critiques aren't written for the creators, and like, we most of the time don't want to hear it because you're just going to tell us why we can do the thing better that we already finished. Like, and so I think for me, that's an important thing to remember, that when I'm critiquing something, I'm usually doing it from either perspective of a consumer who's trying to recommend or not recommend something for people who like similar things that I do. Yeah. Or if I am coming at from a creative perspective, I'm trying not to do it in a way that I'm telling this person how they can do their job better. It's more from here's from a creative perspective what I would have done differently. Not that that's what they should do, but more of like, if I was going to create something, this is how I kind of would do it. And so being somebody who wants to create things and trying to critique things from that sort of creative perspective that people don't always do, it's more of me trying to analyze, well, what are the takeaways that I can take away for creating my stuff better?
Yeah.
Sort of. Not how you can do your job better, because I know your job is hard.
Yep.
And no matter what you do, there's going to be people who hate it and people who like it. So it's kind of more of, what can I do in my stuff that doesn't do this, because I know that I don't like this.
Definitely. Yeah. And there is something to be said. Like, one of the reasons we started doing this is because we were doing it full time in classes at college, and like, it was fun. Like, it is fun to dig into things. It's investigative.
It's ruined things for me, but not in a bad way. It's more of like, I enjoy critiquing things.
Open.
I enjoy telling people why they should watch things for like specific reasons.
Yeah,
and like,
definitely.
I enjoy kind of
it's a
picking
blast.
things apart and just having conversations like this. So
yeah, but at the end of the day, I think that's an awesome last perspective. So on that note, we will wrap it up. Otherwise, that's it?
I think that's it.
I think it's it.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Ran our guts out. All right, cool. Well, you can send this episode and any of our other episodes from our catalog to your friends via iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, YouTube, or Spotify. On both of our Twitter pages and our show Twitter page, we do have these posted at the very top. I think the only one we don't have listed is TuneIn Radio, because it literally like wouldn't fit all the characters. Really? But for all those other major platforms, you can go to our Twitter pages to find those for the web links, and you can follow Phil and I on Instagram and Twitter at I am Phil Sorensen and at JK in Pop Culture. The show Twitter is Pop Culture at Pop Culture Punks. We have an email which you can send topic ideas, points of discussion, your own pop culture recommendations. If you think that there's things we should check out and watch, we'd really love to see those, especially as like.
And if you did send those to us, we would talk about them in the actual show, not like the video or whatever.
Yes, correct.
It'd be easier to do here.
Correct. So you can send any of those recommendations or your thoughts or insights to popculturepunks@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment or direct message on Twitter. Same thing on Instagram for our post that goes up every Monday. We have a Redbubble and Threadless store. If you're interested in supporting the show financially, we've got some merch and some designs. I'm hoping I have an idea for like a summer themed shirt that I'm trying to wrap up and do, but we'll see. It's just it's like one of those stupid concepts where I was like, I think this is really funny, but I don't know if other people think it's really funny. So we'll see when that's done. As a reminder, this is the last episode of May. There will not be an episode coming out Memorial Day. So we are personally taking it because we're trying to set up the next few months, but be sure to remember our veterans who are sacrificing their lives and giving their time from their families and from the safe haven of the States to go overseas.
And it's specifically people who have died.
Yes.
Veterans Day is for people who are alive but also served.
They're all special. They're all important.
Just remember the troops.
Remember the troops.
And the people who have died for our country.
Yes. So I had three grandfathers, I think, actually, who were in the military, and we've had friends who were in ROTC, and I know your brother was a Marine, and so
technically still is
a Marine,
Yeah.
But so they're important to us. They're cool folks, and we appreciate them. So shout out to the troops. Love you guys. So there will be no episode next week. Be sure to tune in to the Imperious Rex YouTube channel. They've got some awesome videos over there, and we will be joining their Swamp Thing Volume 2 live stream Saturday the 25th, I believe, 25th. At 7 p.m. Central Time. Thanks for tuning in. I don't think there's any other updates or news.
Nope.
That's the gist. Hopefully this was semi-coherent and semi-interesting to listen to. It was a lot of theology and philosophy and deep thoughts, but we thank you for listening. We appreciate you tuning in every week, and we will catch you in the beginning of June with our time with Imperious Rex. And until then, we bid you a fun Cowabunga.
Booyah.